If you have been asking if healing is real,
stick around and find out that healing is for real, and we don't mean maybe. My name is Tony.
and I am Zane, and we are two witnesses and representatives
Of the miraculous gospel of healing.
Boom!
Bam!
This is Zane Pierre and Tony Myers on the Gospel of Healing podcast, the miraculous Gospel of Healing podcast, and we are coming to you today with a follow-up from the last episode. We were actually having a post-conversation after the episode, post-episode conversation, and we thought, you know what, it's a good idea to talk about Old Covenant versus New Covenant. Since in the Westernized Christian world, we're so obsessed with the Old Covenant. Now, one of the differences in particular with the Old Covenant and New Covenant is, most people are not aware of the fact that the Old Covenant had two phases. The first phase, the Old Covenant was actually a response to the Garden of Eden. The covenant was meant to bring you back into the garden. What I just said there is like brain explosion for most people, right? Moses was actually the one that God called to take on the name of the man in the garden, to go back to the serpent in the desert and take the garden people back and bring them back into the garden, which is the promised land. Which means the covenant is about coming back into the garden. But the covenant had two phases. The first phase, which is the phase that Israel, everybody talks about, is where Israel will do the things that the man in the garden would not do. Now, when it was translated, the translators put the word commandments. And God's side, they put promises. But it's the same Hebrew word, which means it's promises on both sides. It wasn't rules, it was promises. Right? Which makes a big deal of a difference to get started with.
It wasn't rules. Promises.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Right? So if you're actually saying is rules, because it's the same Hebrew word that's used for both sides, then you have to say God gave himself rules too. Right? You have to equalize it. So it was actually promises, like giving God your word, and God gave Israel his word. Right? Now that was about 613 things, that is of oversimplification, of course, that a man in the garden wouldn't do. And once you don't do that, then it upgraded you, because the 613 things was literally the things a person of equity would not do. Once you became equitable, you became a priest of God, which is why you read in the scriptures, like in Exodus, it says, you keep the commandments and God will upgrade them to a kingdom of priests. Right? So those two phases. You do the things in the man in the garden wouldn't do, and it upgrades you to a kingdom of priests. And when you upgrade there, now you take on the name of God and start to fulfill God's promises to the people, which means now you could fulfill the promises. The new covenant is simply the elimination of the validation aspect of it. And Jesus has actually started you off in the upgrade. So you start as a priest, and all of these promises is now your laws of how you're supposed to be living. Which means healing is not something, is a privilege. Healing is now your commandment to be healed. Like, you don't have an option. You shouldn't be watching God and saying, well, he's not giving it to me. In the same way, you were supposed to live and not steal in the old thing, in the old system. In the same way, you're supposed to be living healed now. Like, that's a commandment. You are supposed to be healed. So in the difference is, and this dynamic is not taught. So everybody actually looking at Moses' law, and you know one of the things that has screwed up the Westernized mind, Holy Brother? They were not aware of the fact that you were supposed to keep these promises to show yourself to be a person of equity so that you could start to function as a priest of God. And then the priest had the responsibility to manifest what God said. What Westernized Christianity was taught was, keep the rules and God in the sky will drop it like Santa whilst he passing on the sleigh. And that's a big difference right there.
Now, I'm only throwing a wrench in here
Uh-huh.
because I would bet 95% of those listening do not know this. You want to hear it? I'm asking, do you want to hear it?
Let's go. Let's go.
Most Christians think that God ordained animal sacrifices, and he did not.
And that comes from the idea that people actually think along the lines, this is a misconception that we have in the Westernized world, that the Bible is a book that fell from heaven, and because it fell from heaven, everything about it is just fully God's perspective on how things are supposed to be done.
I believe the whole Bible.
The Bible is not that. Do you know? And this is actually to add value to what you're just saying there. The Bible or the Torah was not just meant, which is why I notice in the New Testament, Paul tells people like Peter that the Gentiles do not need to know the Jewish way of life to serve Christ, because the scriptures was never meant to start a particular strict culture. The scriptures acknowledges all cultures as created by God, and the scriptures are actually meant to take every culture and just bring everything back to justice and fairness, to equity. That's all. To take your country and bring it into equity, which means all of the animal sacrifices that you see in there, it was not something that fell from heaven. They were accustomed with that from Egypt. And all it was bringing things into equity, their lifestyle.
But as soon as you say that word justice, then to the Western mindset, that means there has to be punitive action taken.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that's because that's our understanding of it.
That's why we have the penal substitution, which is not true.
It is not true at all.
Which is why most people are taught that the animal sacrifices were necessary until Jesus. No, God never ordained them. And that's in the King James Version. You can give me any translation. I can show you over 15 verses where God never ordained the animal sacrifices. That was brought in from the pagans.
It actually says in the scriptures that he didn't desire sacrifice.
Yep.
It says it more than once. It says it more than once. But that's something in particular.
I abhor your animal sacrifices and your feasts.
It was all about the heart, always. But these people came with a culture. I hear people even take it. Just last night I was having a conversation with one of the master mentors of the Institute. And we were speaking about that, how people actually have taken even the idea of, like they go in the Bible and say, see, especially those people who criticize the Bible, saying, see, the Bible condones slavery. And I sit down and just watch him and say, oh, you do not even know how ignorant you sounded. Because what slavery was back then was not what we know within the slave trade that took place in the 1800s, 1700s. It's actually the same way you actually have an employee in society today. That is the context of a slave. You come and you work for somebody and you live by them, and you're actually their employee. You were paid, or you're paying off a debt.
They were not mistreated.
They were not mistreated. They actually, when they come in
They-
there, people used to seek families to work for, because once you come in, the wealthy family will take care of your family because you're working
Yep.
for them. And so these are things in particular, whether it's sacrifice, slavery, all of these concepts that we have. And because people don't know the history of the scriptures, you're actually watching it and you're thinking, well, God ordained this. God never ordained anything. The Bible is not about that. The Bible is actually bringing fairness, treating people equitably. So it comes into society, doesn't say you need to stop this. It means the question is, what does it mean to be equitable with regards to what you're doing?
Justice is restoration.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, once again, the Western mindset would say you have to bring people to justice. Therefore, when there's an infraction, there has to be a punitive action,
Yeah.
which is where hell comes from,
Yes.
which is why we supposedly have the penal substitution. God did not need, nor did he want, a human sacrifice. That was demanded upon men.
Yeah.
Men demanded Jesus' sacrifice, not God. This was not to appease God. Furthermore, guess what? Jesus says that very thing, or Paul does actually. Abel blood demanded vengeance, whereas Christ's blood speaks of better things.
Right. Right.
Because Christ's blood was speaking life, not vengeance.
Yeah.
It was man who spoke with vengeance. Are you with me?
Yeah, this whole idea, I said, it's all centered in the westernized educational way. When we hear things like justice and things like that, we think, as you adequately put it, your mind goes to punitive action. Like most people are actually believers are not? They have been so it's so brainwashed into the idea of the hell that like it doesn't cross their mind that what you want to term punitive action is just you reaping what you sow here, which is where death comes in. You sow that in here, and death is actually the follow-up of that. It's not, there is nothing like it is beyond. And let me explain something this to probably get some context to the scriptures there. I have heard a lot of people, and this is really good a topic when regards to even understanding healing. I've heard a lot of people look at the Bible and say, God in the Bible was such a wrathful God. And if you believe that, it's because you do not know the context of the Bible. Number one, the Garden of Eden is the narrative that sets the precedent for the entire scriptures. The laws of the garden gives context to the Bible. And one of the laws of the garden is that two of the laws. Number one is every spirit reproduces after its own kind. And the law of sowing and reaping, that comes from that first law, that everything reproduces after its own kind. Right? You sow and you reap. Secondly, everybody has been taught Moses' law in the westernized Christian culture, but nobody actually taught that God's name in Exodus 34 was the compass that they used to know how to apply the law. And the first half of his name speaks about grace. The second half is speaking to the guilty and holding them responsible for their actions. In our terms, the first half of the name identified how somebody with a sincere heart will be treated by God, which is with grace and compassion. The person who is arrogant, who knows that he oppressing people, but still want to do it because he wants what he wants, that person would face decisions because you are not helping people, you're trying to destroy them for your own benefit. Now, because of this, the scriptures actually continues where you see, again, the garden gives you context to this. Inside of the garden, man is in God's presence. Outside of the garden is not, if you read the garden through the laws, through their perspective, they did not understand the garden from the context that God kicked the man out of the garden. They understood the garden from the perspective that the man sowed this and he inherited the desert. So you could say from the context of the scriptures that he chose to actually walk away from God. God didn't leave him. He walked away from God and created this perspective. Now, because the Jews or the Israelites, they see the creation as one God, when you make your decision to move away from the covenant, which is you walking away from the presence of God, God is sending the prophet to tell you, come back to the garden, come back to his presence, come back to the garden atmosphere. The reason why he's doing that is because you go in that direction and there's only one thing that you're going to reap. So they say God destroyed them, but if you read it in the garden, you understand what they're saying God destroyed them is because they see God as God in all. But what really happened is what Isaiah said. Isaiah said, your wickedness is what disciplines you. Which means there is no wrathful God. It's because you're reaping what you sow. Now, these simple dynamics here, the Bible stands on, but nobody has taught that. Or at least nobody cared to really find out what is the paradigm of the scriptures and stop reading it as though you're reading your constitution for your land. Does that make sense?
Now, I'm going to put this the blue-haired prophet way.
Go ahead.
The garden, what you get, and hey, I love your garden perspective.
Right.
Absolutely love it. Here's another perspective. The duality came into man. God never changed.
Exactly.
God saw good.
Yeah.
God was all good. Now, God didn't change, but now man saw God as both good and evil.
Yes, sir.
So what you see in the old covenant is man's perspective of God change. So now, therefore, he's the one that did all the evil. That's one way to handle all the old covenant scriptures. That was man's idea, not God's.
Right.
That is not God's nature in any way. And so me and Zane are saying the same thing.
You're just reaping what you sow. It's not God doing that.
Exactly. Sodom and Gomorrah. God did not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. They did, because their actions were evil. They, like kind, they received what they put out.
Exactly.
All these instances of the wrathful God. Now, in the true essence of the words, is a passionate God, always pursuing us.
For real. Always asking them to
That
come
is
back.
what God is. And when you look up, I think it's the Greek and the Hebrew words, that's what it's talking about, passion. They use the word wrath, and which, when you look up wrath in a dictionary, and it does state passionate pursuit.
Right.
We've taken it to be a thing of vengeance. It's not.
That's the interpretation, yes.
It is God passionately pursuing us.
Even if you look at the scriptures, you'll notice that the purpose of the yearly atonement was like if you were told that you would be exempt from the yearly atonement, what they understood was that you'd be exempt from the presence of God. And that is not, again, that's not God moving away from you. That's because of your heart going in a particular direction. And you were not included in that because you're not of the same spirit anymore. It's the same thing as God is a mango tree and you decide you want to be oranges. It is not that God moved away from you. You chose to be oranges, so you separated your spirit from that spirit. all through the scriptures, what you're calling God's wrath on Israel, you have to understand that the covenant sees everything as in God. So they don't mean that God, the person, did that. It's because God is all and in all, they would say, well, God did this. But if you understand it from the garden, the laws of the garden, what they're really saying is, you reap that on your own.
Yep.
Because what you're calling law of sin and reaping is understood to be the spirit that fills the earth. And you're sowing into that field, as science put it.
And it's the same idea behind where most translations says God drove them out of the garden. No, they left the garden.
They left themselves, they drove themselves out there. And they actually, and this is the concept that is actually coming from in the garden. Like, for example, this is a really good point right here. We read the scriptures that says God put man in the garden. Because you live in naturally westernized lens, you don't understand that the garden or the whole garden is based on the principle of the self-existent. And if it's based on the principle of the self-existent, it means that they had the thought and they moved themselves into the garden. If they left the garden, then they moved themselves out of the garden. Just like the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness, it wasn't that Jesus was, God taking him from here and resting down in the wilderness. No, it said the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness in the same context. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, and it says, when you go back to the text, because the scriptures work where in the Hebraic construct, once you see a concept, you need to find where it's mentioned first, and the first mention gives you the definition. And if you go back to the first definition of drove, that the Holy Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness, it's mentioned that God drove them out of the garden.
Right.
The parallel that you'll see there, if I remember it clearly, it is paralleled with sent, which means God did not push them out. The context of sent, like Jesus was always saying, I am sent of the Father, is because he has a thought, and once you take action on the thought, you are understood to be the messenger. It is not something that God drives on you, it's something that you choose to do.
Now, let me bring up this, because I've heard this said many times. And I'm sure, let's see what your explanation is. People will always say, well, God planted that tree of the knowledge of good and evil,
right,
to test Adam and Eve out. Why did he plant the tree? My response is normally exactly what you did. No, he didn't.
Well, this is very briefly, because I don't want to stray off of the healing topic, right?
Right.
But to put this very briefly, first of all, you understand, this is westernized understanding. Westernized understanding that God created the garden, put man in the garden, is flawed. The ancient prophets do not believe that. The ancient prophets that God created man and man created the garden. Now, here's something in particular that you should consider. Listen up, right? Everybody listening. Listen carefully. Jesus is identified as the first and the last, which is identifying the first from the garden and the last. And if he's the first from the garden, therefore, if he identifies the first, that means that you could watch Jesus to understand the man in the garden. Everything that is said about Jesus gives you insight about the man in the garden. Therefore, if he's called the firstborn of all creation, and from him everything was made that was made, then that means that is what the man in the garden was, because he's identifying as the first. He was the firstborn of creation, and everything was made that was made from him. Now, to say that God created the tree, I just throwing this out, just as a little thing to think about, right? To say that God created the tree to test man is the same thing as saying that Jesus, who is identified as the first, created the tree to test man. And if he's identified as the first, then my question to you is, where did Jesus leave something here to test you? Or are you being tested by your own knowledge? Your own knowledge that you created? Just something to think about.
And not only that, but we've got the verse in James straight up. Do not say. Right there.
Because God tempts no man.
That God tempts no man. It's not God tempting anyone, nor is it the devil. It's ourselves.
So here's...
And James actually goes on to say exactly that.
Exactly.
That you of your own selves bring it up, and then the action follows.
Yes.
It ain't no devil. It ain't no demon. You yourself, your thoughts, and then you build upon those thoughts, because like thoughts create like thoughts.
And if you're building those thoughts and every spirit reproduces after the own kind, what is really the devil? If every spirit reproduces after his own kind, what is really the devil? What is really the devil? Is it this person running you down? Or is it that you actually playing the role? Because you creating the thoughts. So just to be very brief, this is what the garden narrative is, right? God created man, man created the garden. What is called the tree of life, which is why it is being referred to in the New Testament, is that because the Spirit of God in the man was multiplied in a garden, you could have put the garden and the man to stand up next to each other, and every component of the garden revealed a quality in the man. Which means the same role that the breath of life played in his body and in creation, the tree of life was made to replicate that, to show how it gives life to the garden. That is a mirror. It's actually a mirror. And so the man was supposed to cultivate the tree, because he created the tree. The tree, as a multiplication of a spirit, revealed how he worked. If you put the garden and the man next to each other, it's actually like, you could say it's like a twin, basically, because if he reproduces it, it is his spirit. Just that he is therefore the father of the garden. God is his father. He is the father of the garden. He is the father of heaven and earth. Right? That this is not taught in church. And I understand that, but take your time and digest it. So the tree of life there represented what his function was, like what the function, the breath of life in him. It represented how the wisdom of God in him worked. The tree represented the wisdom of the garden, how the garden would work. Now, the tree therefore mirrored him, but it was his creation. He was supposed to cultivate it. Instead, he began to think about what it would mean to eat from the tree. The serpent was a helper that functioned on his thoughts. The serpent was not a mercenary that came and tempted him. The serpent functioned on a thought that he received from the man himself.
So who planted the tree of good and evil? Man.
Man. It was Yahweh man. And therefore, he switched the role. Instead of maintaining father over the garden, he started to use the tree as his father. And there's the conundrum of mankind, still using creation to try to get validation. So I hope that settles that argument.
And with that, bam, be healed.
Boom. It is true and real. Rah.